On the outside, she looked like a sweet, caring woman. On the inside, she was calculating her next victim. She posed as a caregiver, but in Austria, she became known as something entirely different. A woman who murdered the very people she was supposed to protect and love. Every person who trusted her got weaker and weaker until they never woke up. Austria called her the Black Widow. Welcome to Glass Coffin Story. Thank you for tuning in and joining me today. The case we're exploring today unfolds in Austria. The case of Elfriede Blauensteiner made headlines across the continent and remains one of the most infamous in Austrian criminal history. She appeared to be a caring, motherly, and extraordinarily charismatic woman with a magnetic presence and highly refined social intelligence. Anyone with elderly parents would have been thrilled to entrust their loved ones to a caregiver like Elfriede Blauensteiner. Yet this initial impression could not have been further from the truth. Elfriede Blauensteiner was a manipulative psychopath who committed the most heinous crimes for the basest of motives. Money to fuel her gambling addiction. Before diving into the case, I want to clarify, as I do with every story, that I allow myself a certain interpretive latitude in presenting the events as I understand them. My assessment is entirely subjective, yet everything I recount has been researched to the best of my knowledge. Blauensteiner was charged with multiple crimes, but because crucial evidence had been destroyed or was otherwise unavailable, she could not be convicted of every crime. I will proceed chronologically, beginning with her childhood, and at the end of the video, out of respect for the victims, I will provide a summary of the convictions and the charges that did not result in guilty verdict. To comprehend her actions, we must start with her childhood. Elfriede Blauensteiner was born on January 22nd, 1939 as Elfriede Martha Zelinka, the seventh of 11 children in total. She entered the world already frail, afflicted with a heart defect, but the family's dire financial situation meant no doctor was ever consulted. She grew up in the working-class district of Vienna under brutally harsh conditions, right in the midst of the interwar period and the slide towards the Second World War. The family was desperately poor. Food, clothing, and basic necessities were perpetually scarce. There was never enough of anything. Her father died in 1943, leaving Elfriede and her siblings half orphans. They lived in squalid, unhygienic conditions. The apartment was filthy, and the children frequently went hungry. Her mother remarried soon afterward, a deeply brutal man with whom she had several more children. Within a few years, the household comprised 11 children, the mother and her new husband. The mother was emotionally distant and neglectful. After entering her second marriage, she devoted even less time to her children and far more time to her new husband. It must be emphasized that in 1930s, marked by the aftermath of the First World War and the inexorable descent into the Second, cannot be judged by today's standards. The conditions were merciless for everyone. The marriage between the stepfather and Elfriede's mother was volatile. It escalated to the point that she threatened to leave him if he did not stop beating the children. The cramped living situation bred constant tension. The children slept on the floor, were malnourished, and frequently fell ill. This infuriated the stepfather, who was often jolted from sleep by coughing children and responded with even greater violence. Elfriede's relationship with her mother was extremely difficult. Elfriede described her mother in deeply negative terms throughout her life. When one of her siblings fell ill with scarlet fever, the mother said it would be better if the child simply fell asleep and never woke up again because she couldn't afford a doctor. Another sibling was seriously ill with a high fever for a long time. The mother refused to call a doctor, thinking the child would soon recover. The child died. Only then she called a doctor, who could only issue the death certificate. Elfriede found a way to escape her stepfather's beatings by playing a kind of game with him. She called it Anna and the Robbers as a child, but it wasn't really a game. She took on small jobs, running errands, cleaning, to earn a little money, and she gave that money to her stepfather as part of the so-called game. That way she was spared the beatings. If you want to interpret This in light of her later behavior as a child. She was exploited by her stepfather, and later in life she turned the tables. She became the one in the position of power who exploited weaker, defenseless people. This pattern runs through all of her later relationships and always ends in disaster. Her mother saw the children mainly as a source of income. After her first husband died, each child received a half orphan's pension, and she lived off those payments. Since Elfriede's childhood took place in the 1930s, it's worth mentioning that her stepfather joined the Nazi party. Because of that, the family received certain benefits: a larger apartment with a garden and a better standard of living. At the start of World War II in 1939, her brothers were caught up one after another, and the stepfather was also drafted and later died on the Eastern Front. Elfriede consistently described her mother in her biography as bad and cold-blooded. For example, she never accompanied any of her sons to a train when they left for the front, even though the chances of returning were slim. As the war neared its end, the mother fled to the countryside with the children to escape the bombings. Elfriede and her older sisters were responsible, among other things, for procuring food. Rationing was extremely strict, and the family suffered hunger. After the war ended, amazingly, all of her brothers returned. Some more injured than others. One even had malaria, but their own mother didn't pick them up at the train station. Unlike other mothers who joyfully embraced their sons, Elfriede cared for her brothers with great devotion. Her first serious romantic relationship was macabre, to say the least. She married at a very young age a man named Alfred Franz. Marrying young wasn't unusual in itself, but her groom, Alfred Franz, had previously been in a relationship with Elfriede's own sister. The sister had even become pregnant by him. Nevertheless, Elfriede went ahead and married him, even though her sister had a child from this man. Elfriede and her husband, Alfred, moved into a nice apartment with a garden. Elfriede worked in a bakery, ran the household, beautified and tended the garden. Shortly after the wedding, Elfriede gave birth to a daughter. Unfortunately, the child did not strengthen the bond between the spouses. Alfred Franz was unfaithful throughout the marriage. He had numerous affairs with both younger and older women who showered him with generous financial gifts. Alfred Franz encountered certain job difficulties, ultimately cost him his job. The result of that was that the couple could no longer afford their elegant apartment and relocated to a poorer district on Vienna's outskirts. Alfred spent his days at home, socializing with his friends and drinking heavily, essentially contributing nothing to the household. Elfriede, by contrast, worked full-time just to make ends meet, ran the household, cared for their daughter while was pregnant with their second child. Arguments escalated and Alfred became increasingly violent and frustrated. In one particular brutal incident, he struck her in the abdomen when she was 7 months pregnant, causing her to miscarry. This miscarriage must have been incredibly traumatic. The couple did not divorce immediately. After this tragedy, they continued living together, but one crucial change occurred. Elfriede began frequenting casinos. She was drawn to slot machines and played roulette with passion. The casino atmosphere offered a temporary distraction from her domestic reality. Her husband hated her casino visits, and he was utterly against her going. Elfriede once claimed she won 460,000 shillings. This would be 200,000 today, adjusted to the inflation. She claimed that she won this huge amount of money in one evening and that she had a sort of system for winning roulette. After 9 years, Alfred left her. They officially divorced in 1967 because Elfriede initially refused to agree to the divorce. Even before the separation, her relationship with men was poor. She had only married Alfred to escape her hated parental home and gain some financial stability. Being abandoned with a child only fueled her hatred of men further. There are clear explanations in her childhood and early adult life for why she later committed her crimes that can be helpful to understand, but I want to stress many people have terrible childhoods and extremely hard lives, especially in the post-war period. None of her 10 siblings who suffered just as much and more under their stepfather's violence, and grew up in the same impoverished, unhygienic conditions ever committed. Her relationship with her own daughter was also extremely difficult. She was unable to break the cycle of violence she had learned in her childhood. She beat the girl brutally and was anything but a loving mother. Later in life, Elfriede tried to overcompensate. She kept a clean household, always dressed elegantly, wore jewellery and expensive fur coats. She wanted to be perceived as financially very well off and basically wealthy. During her life, she had countless employers. During interrogation, she claimed around 40 different jobs. She said every single employer had treated her badly, which is why she had to change jobs so often. 40 different jobs is an extraordinary high number, especially considering that 50 years ago it was normal to train for a profession and stay with one employer until retirement. Switching jobs on such a scale would be remarkable even today. And of course, she only blamed her employers, insisting each had mistreated her and basically forced her to move on. Around 1970, a few significant things happened. Took a new job as a housekeeper for the Reindl family. Her now grown daughter moved out, and she met a man who would soon become her second husband, a man called Rudolf Blauensteiner. Rudolf was 34 when he met the almost 10 years older Elfriede. Unlike her first husband, Rudolf seemed to have his life together. He was a civil servant with the Austrian Federal Railways, had a respected position, earned good money, which meant that he would enjoy later on an excellent pension. At first, Elfriede didn't like Rudolf. He was divorced with 3 children, had mild epilepsy, which he had managed well since childhood, and chronic lung problems. He smoked up to 60 cigarettes a day. His solid financial situation obviously spoke in his favor, so she married him. After their wedding, they moved into an apartment in Vienna. Among the neighbors, Elfriede was seen as a well-off, friendly lady who always strutted around in fur coats and lavish jewelry, looking as if she were extremely rich. Rudolf adored Elfriede. He was captivated by her charm and caring nature. But from the start, he had a big problem with her excessive gambling. By this point, her addiction was undeniable. Rudolf hated how much money she lost at the casino. The bright lights, the clatter of coins, and the stuff at the casino treated Elfriede like a royal lady, basically. Those casino visits really boosted her self-esteem. She became a regular visitor at one particular casino, which was located in Baden, which is on the outskirts of Vienna. She was always elegantly dressed. The staff really liked her because she was tipping so well. Her casino visits were a constant source of conflict between her and her husband. Rudolf, at one point, wanted to forbid her from going, but Elfriede wasn't the kind of woman who let herself be told what to do, so she started going to the casino behind his back. Her new job with the elderly couple, who were called Otto and Victoria Reindl, went well at first. The retired couple were delighted with Elfriede's services: shopping, cooking, cleaning, running the household. Elfriede started calling Otto Reindl Daddykins and Victoria Mommykins, while they called her little girl or girly. These overly cute nicknames feel almost aggressive in their artificial sweetness, and these coiling diminutives acquire an almost sinister undertone in light of what she's about to do. Victoria Reindl was diabetic, but managed her daily life reasonably well. She took a drug called Jewellery, which was a blood sugar lowering medication specifically for diabetics. She took this drug, Jewellery, every day. However, she often skipped meals. This frequently caused dizziness and drowsiness as her blood sugar plummeted. Elfriede observed exactly how Jewellery worked on Victoria and started experimenting with the drug Jewellery on Otto Reindl, who was not diabetic. Elfriede prepared all meals with apparent devotion and was already an accomplished cook. She introduced small doses of euglycon into Otto's food, monitoring symptoms closely, and even small amounts of euglycon left him dazed and profoundly weakened. She gradually increased the dosage of euglycon. His condition deteriorated rapidly. The consequences of administering euglycon to a non-diabetic are catastrophic. Permanent hypoglycemia caused premature dementia, and Otto needed more and more care. His wife, Victoria, suspected nothing. She thought it was simply due to his age. Victoria's health began declining as well. Victoria herself was a diabetic, and due to her diabetes, she eventually had a foot amputated, which is common in advanced cases of diabetes. She died shortly after the amputation. After Victoria's death, the widowed Otto was prescribed the antidepressant anafranil. Elfriede began adding this drug anafranil to his meals alongside the euglycon. She also started giving small doses of euglycon to her own husband, Rudolf, to calm him down and stop him from forbidding her casino visits. Whenever she planned to go out gambling, she mixed the euglycon into his dinner or homemade lemonade, and he slept through the night and didn't notice that she left. Her casino visits escalated to twice weekly, draining enormous amounts of money. She found Otto Reindel's condition intolerable. She was really annoyed by him, which is ironic because she and she alone was responsible for his dementia. Caring for him disgusted her, so she decided to get rid of him permanently. She escalated the euglycon dosage until he lapsed into a near comatose state, opened the windows in winter, and waited for hypothermia to set in. She then closed the windows and called emergency services. Otto was taken to hospital and died shortly afterward of pneumonia. No one, not the paramedics, not the hospital staff, suspected Elfriede. Everyone who knew Elfriede could not imagine that she had anything to do with the murder of Otto Reindl, because she was highly manipulative. On the contrary, her friends, neighbors, and even her husband comforted her because she appeared to care so much for the Reindl family. People were genuinely saddened by their deaths, precisely because she was considered such a dependable and devoted housekeeper and loving caregiver. A strange dynamic developed. She was praised for how loving she had cared for them, how well she managed the household, how good she supposedly made life for everyone in the Reindl household. The thought that Otto Reindl had died because of her was simply unimaginable for those around her. Her husband Rudolf's health had been declining as well, but he remained relatively fit. He was working his job without restrictions until Elfriede began escalating euglycon doses. He required multiple hospitalizations, yet recovered swiftly each time. Elfriede spread tales of his grave illness, expressing pity to neighbors. People admired her for being such selfless in caring for her husband, even though she was 10 years older than he was. The approval she received from her friends and from her whole social environment was overwhelming. Everyone praised her dedication and her supposed kindness. I'm certain she loved all that attention. In the media, she always portrayed herself as a kind of saint, wanting everyone to see her as a caring, self-sacrificing woman who devoted herself to others. In light of what later became known, all of this now has a horrifying undertone because she was the one responsible. In hospital, free from her tampering with his meals, he improved dramatically. Upon discharge, she administered a massive overdose of euglycon. He was rushed to hospital and died on August 10th, 1992, aged only 52. Elfriede ensured his cremation, eliminating any possibility of exhumation. They had been married just under 10 years. As a civil servant widow, she received a generous pension, approximately $2,000 monthly in today's terms, adjusted to inflation, plus her own pension. She later confessed in court to administering euglycon to basically stimulating his appetite and due to the fact that he was cremated, it wasn't possible to do an autopsy. After her husband's death, she was grieving publicly in black attire. It didn't take long for Elfriede to find her next victim, an elderly, frail neighbor named Franziska Kerbel. Elfriede cared for her, cooked lavish meals, and kept her company, the usual pattern. Franziska had been alone for a long time and had a very strained relationship with her adult son, something Elfriede could relate to since her own daughter hated her. Elfriede also gave Franziska a nickname. Translated into English, it would be Worry Mommy, although it sounds better in German. These infantilizing nicknames feel extremely creepy. When the conflict with Franziska's son escalated to the point that Franziska attempted suicide, Elfriede took her into her own apartment, and in return, Franziska did something that would cost her her life. Franziska transferred all her savings books to Elfriede and paid off her angry son with a small amount of money. Elfriede would have been able to inherit the savings books after Franziska's death. Elfriede started mixing euglycol into Franziska's food and lemonade, small doses at first. Franziska ate a lot of chocolate, which counteracted the hypoglycemia several times and saved her life temporarily. Eventually, Elfriede increased the euglycol dose massively, and Franziska didn't manage to eat anything sweet in time, collapsed, and died in hospital of severe hypoglycemia in 1992. Elfriede's motive was once again her greed for money, so that she could continue gambling it away at the casino. A few years later, during Elfriede's trial, Franziska's body was exhumed. Large amounts of fluid were found in the coffin, and euglycol could be detected. She had received an enormous dose shortly before death. When Franziska died in hospital, it was once again unthinkable that Elfriede could have had anything to do with it. Within weeks, she put advertisements in newspapers, describing herself as a domestic widow seeking a nice gentleman, even mentioning her body measurements. She received around 80 replies and carefully selected only a man with houses and savings. A man called Friedrich Decker, age 64, replied on one of her advertisements. He owned a house with a garden in Lower Austria, and he had several saving accounts. When the both of them first met, he fell head over heels for the charismatic Elfriede. The whole village talked about how this simple man had landed such a glamorous woman. Elfriede moved in to his house, to the countryside, to Lower Austria, and took over the household immediately. She cooked elaborate meals and even started renovating the house and tended the garden. The neighbors adored her. She was always nice and smiling, and she was always ready for a chat with a neighbor. They thought she was a hardworking and warm woman, and that this man, Friedrich Decker, that he was really lucky with her. She also gave him a nickname. She called him Fritzl, which is basically the sweet version of Friedrich. Within weeks, they decided to marry, but only in church, so she wouldn't lose Rudolf's, her second husband's, widow's pension. Friedrich, he didn't seem to mind that, because they only had a church wedding, which she insisted on because she was Catholic, and she told Friedrich she could not live in sin with him. This is so ironic that she calls herself a Catholic. I just can't believe this. He transferred all his savings to her, as well as the house and the garden. She claimed that he wanted to do this of his own accord. And I do believe that she was capable of manipulating him to the point that he did indeed transfer everything to her voluntarily, and even was the one suggesting doing it. He had signed a gift contract making her sole heir. And immediately afterward, Friedrich's health rapidly declined. He withdrew completely and refused visitors. As always, she mixed euglycol into his food. I want to stress how quickly Friedrich Decker had transferred everything to Elfriede 2 weeks after her moving into his house. It is also worth mentioning that her lawyer Harold Schmidt drafted this deed of gift. Friedrich suffered from severe hypoglycemia over several weeks, which caused him to quickly suffer brain damage and become demented. Because of his bad health state, Elfriede decided to move together with Friedrich into her apartment in Vienna, which she had of course not given up, so that they could be closer to the hospital. After them moving in to her apartment, when Friedrich was still alive but his condition became more and more critical, she sold his house and the garden. Since she had carried out renovation work beforehand, this massively increased the selling price. It is truly vicious, and I highly doubt that Friedrich noticed any of this, as he was already demented due to the euglycon poisoning she had inflicted on him. While they were living in Vienna, several hospital stays followed. Elfriede made sure they always went to a different hospital in order not to arouse suspicion. When Friedrich's condition became unbearable for Elfriede, gave him massively high dose of euglycon and he slipped into a coma. She opened the windows and placed frozen towels on his chest. He was taken to the hospital, severely hypothermic, and died there in autumn of 1995 of pneumonia. After his death, neighbors were already whispering that something wasn't right. No one dared to say anything. Elfriede once again presented herself as a mourning widow, trying to get sympathy. At the hospital, Elfriede claimed that Friedrich wanted to donate his body to science, which wasn't true. She wanted to prevent an autopsy from being performed, and this is exactly what happened. His body was donated to the medical institute, although there was an official funeral service. Elfriede didn't even wait until the funeral had taken place. She immediately placed a new newspaper ad to meet a new man who longed for a so-called domestic wife. Through the newspaper advertisement she had placed, she met Alois Pickler. He was 76 and already a few years retired. He suffered with polio-related paralysis, but this didn't impact him in his day-to-day life. He was otherwise pretty healthy. He owned a house, a garden, and savings worth 75,000 at today's value roughly. He was widowed 2 years prior. His late wife died of cancer. He was struggling maintaining his household. He was exactly what Elfriede had been looking for. He was living alone, he was affluent, and he had no close relatives. They met, had a nice dinner, and she moved into his house on the countryside almost immediately after they met. She started her so-called caregiver duties, searched for his savings books in the house while she was cleaning. She started, as she did with her previous victims as well, to isolate him. She was even forbidding his former housekeeper of entering the property, basically, to enter his house, to come and visit him. His housekeeper, who used to be a really close friend, found this whole behavior of her incredibly suspicious. She administered euglycon to his meals, and when her supplies of euglycon ran low, she started using anafranil, the antidepressant, as well. On a cold November night in 1995, a massive anafranil dose made him unconscious. She induced hypothermia with open windows and frozen towels. She had even placed him in cold water in the bathtub to accelerate the hypothermia process. The fact that she had used anafranil would become her downfall, as she had underestimated the effects. She expected that he, like her other victims, would die in the hospital, but that was not the case. He died at home unexpectedly on this particular November night in 1995, within 8 weeks of their first meeting. Post-mortem, Elfriede and her lawyer, Harold Schmidt, faked an oral will, naming her the sole heir. Elfriede believed that he had no relatives at all, but that wasn't entirely true. He had an adoptive nephew, and his nephew was very angry when he learned of his uncle's death and realized he had been cheated out of his inheritance. He went to the police together with the former housekeeper. Rumors were swirling in the village. No one could explain what happened or why the otherwise healthy Alois died only 2 months after meeting this woman. At this point, it must be underlined that she had truly escalated. She had known Alois for barely 2 months, and she already killed him. An autopsy revealed lethal anaphrenial concentration despite no prescription by any doctor. This was incredibly suspicious. The fact that he had such a high dose of anaphrenial in his blood, even though the medication had never been prescribed to him, wasn't sufficient enough to arrest Elfriede immediately, unfortunately. Therefore, Elfriede's phone was placed under police surveillance. Elfriede Blauensteiner appeared at his funeral, but she didn't appear alone. She appeared with a bodyguard, which is just weird because she claimed that the villagers were so hostile toward her and could even attack her. The entire atmosphere was tense. Alois' chosen nephew, whom she had cheated out of his inheritance, was present. She immediately placed another advertisement in the newspaper in which she presented herself as a domestic widow looking for a man, and she did so even before the funeral. While the police were tapping her phone, it became known that after Alice's death, she had called her lawyer Harold Schmidt and asked him to lift the already dead Alois out of the bathtub so that he would not get water in his lungs in order to prevent it from looking at the hospital as though she had drowned him, as well as the fact that the two of them had falsified Alice Pickler's oral will. After that, she was arrested in January 1996 alongside her lawyer Harold Schmidt, so both of them were arrested. Elfriede and her lawyer were detained for 13 months. Elfriede initially denied everything, then confessed surprisingly to 6 murders in graphic detail. Police were shocked, as they had only expected a confession to the murder of Alice Pickler. A few days before trial, which took place on February 10th, 1997, she retracted all confessions, claiming the investigator had threatened her with violence to make a confession. Her lawyer, Schmidt, was convicted of forgery of a will and aggravated fraud, but not for aiding and abetting murder. He received a 7-year prison sentence and lost his license. He was no longer able to work as a lawyer afterward. On March 7th, 1997, Elfriede was sentenced to life in prison for Alois Pickler's murder, fraud, and inheritance manipulation. The judge even underlined that her cruelty and absence of remorse were remarkable. In 2001, 4 years after her first trial, she faced a second trial, strange as it may sound, only because she had given numerous interviews while in prison. In one of these interviews, she said that nothing would make her happier than meeting another man, someone who would stay by her the way her Fritzl did. Fritzl, that was the way she called Friedrich Decker, and that if she were ever released, she wished for such a man. That statement alone is so chilling and pretty alarming. The prosecution panicked, fearing that if she really were released, she would be in her 70s, and given how manipulative she was, she would immediately find the next man. It is also worth mentioning, for context, that those sentenced to life imprisonment do not usually serve a lifetime in prison. Typically, after around 15 years or maybe 20 years, a prisoner can apply for early release. it is actually not common in Austria for people to be given multiple life sentences. But in the case of Elfriede Blauensteiner, she had to face a second trial. In this second trial, she was charged with the murders of Franziska Körbel and Friedrich Döcker. Therefore, Franziska Körbel's body had to be taken from the grave and exhumed, and very high levels of euglycon were found. Friedrich Döcker's body had been donated to science because of Elfriede Blauensteiner. It took some time to find out where his body had ended up, but eventually it was located, and fortunately his body had not yet been used for any medical experiments. In 2001, she was convicted of the murders of Franziska Körbel and Friedrich Döcker. Unfortunately, for the murder of Otto Reindl, she could not be convicted because the killings had happened 20 years earlier, and during the exhumation, only bones remained in the grave, and her husband Rudolf had been cremated. There is also another man whose murder she could not be convicted of, but did confess in the first place and then withdrew the confession. The caretaker of her apartment in Vienna, named Erwin Niedermeyer, who died in 1992. She claimed that she had helped him with suicide because he was in a very bad state, as she put it. I'm somewhat conflicted about the second trial. To be honest, it should not be possible for potentially dangerous people to be released so easily, and life in prison should mean life in prison. And the fact that she enjoyed the media attention so much is something I cannot accept, considering how much suffering she caused. On the other hand, it pays respect to the victims that she was convicted. She greatly enjoyed the entire court proceedings and portrayed herself as a victim of the justice system and as a good soul who only ever wanted to help and care for others. She appeared in court carrying a golden crucifix and quoted Pontius Pilate, "I wash my hands in innocence." Her lack of remorse shocked everyone, the judge and the general public. She appealed the verdicts both times, but the requests were denied. In prison, she ran the kitchen, earned the nickname Mommy, and she still tried to look elegant and wealthy. The fact that she ran the kitchen is so weird, and the fact that she was called Mom or Mommy is just weird and somehow cringy as well. Elfriede Blauensteiner was an evil woman. She ended alone, a fittingly desolate conclusion for a woman who exploited trust with lethal precision. She died in 2003, was cremated. No one mourned for her. None of her siblings or relatives, not even her daughter, visited her grave, and therefore it was dissolved in 2016. This was the case of Elfriede Blauensteiner. I truly welcome your comments, thoughts, and reflections on this disturbing chapter of criminal history. Few cases have left such a deep mark on the public. Even decades later, her name invokes a mixture of disbelief and horror. I would be grateful to hear your perspectives. Your insights are welcome. I would be really happy to see you in my next video. Goodbye.
Was sagen Sie zu der Anklage, Frau Blauensteiner?
Was wollen Sie hören?
Was sagen Sie dazu?
Sagen Sie mir, was Sie hören wollen.
Fühlen Sie sich als Mörder?
Nein,
Drehen Sie sich bitte um. Warum?
weil ich niemanden im Auge habe. Der Herr Bichler tut mir leid. Er ist gestorben. Er tut mir leid, wie jeder, der in meinem Herz verankert war und von mir gegangen ist.
Schwaches Herz, und dann hat er wieder den Krebs, und dann hat sie auch gesagt, er hat Altersepilepsie. Nicht? Haben wir gedacht, also der war ja nie krank. Haben wir gedacht, das gibt es ja nicht, dass unter ein paar Wochen alles Mögliche haben kann. Weil er hat keinen Schnupfen gehabt, er hat keinen Husten gehabt.
Was nehmen Sie, Anafranil oder Glukon?
Na, Anafranil habe ich genommen, nachdem mein Mann gestorben ist und ich nervlich kaputt war. Ich habe schon lange kein Anafranil mehr.
Aber Sie
Denn wenn ich es nicht mehr brauche, entsorge ich es.
Sie geben es.
Das sagen Sie. Sehen Sie, dafür will ich Sie nicht, weil Sie vorlaut sind. Überlegen Sie, was Sie sagen. Sie können nicht Schlüsse ziehen, wo noch gar nichts vorhanden ist. Wie viele Männer sind bei mir verstorben? 5? Vielleicht 10? Ja, 20. Ich bin ja doch die schwarze Witwe, wie ihr mich genannt habt. Ihr seid die Schuldigen. Ihr Journalisten habt über mich die Schmutzlawine geschüttet. Ihr wart es. Warum habt ihr mich so genannt? Warum? Geld ist Macht.
Frau Blauensteiner, sagen Sie mir dazu, um was es geht?
Geld ist Macht.
Nach dem Tod von ihrem Mann hat sie dann praktisch dann wieder einen Bekannten gehabt, ne? Und da hat sie dann wieder geerbt und auf einmal hat sie dann wieder gehört, der ist schon wieder eigentlich, der war gesund und jetzt ist er eigentlich wieder, liegt im Stern, ne? Und das war dann schon eigenartig, ne? Also man hat sich schon gedacht, aber man spricht sowas nicht aus, nicht?
Wie hat sie denn das so entkräftet? Also dass sie gesagt hat sie erzählt, dass die alle so krank waren oder?
Na, an und für sich waren sie erst immer gesund, nicht? Und dann sind sie krank geworden. Und da beim letzten, wie es das schon erzählt hat, da habe ich schon gedacht, na, irgendwas stimmt da nicht. Man sollte da eigentlich irgendwie einen Tipp geben, dass da mal nachkontrollieren dann, nicht? Aber das ist natürlich immer heimlich gesagt worden, weil man will sich da nicht die Zungen verbrennen, nicht?
Das Kruzifix bedeutet für mich, dass nur Gott allein einen Menschen abberufen kann und sonst niemand.
Glauben Sie, dass Gott Ihnen glauben wird?
Ja. Ja. Ich würde niemals töten.
Frau Blauensteiner.
Ja, sie hat schon natürlich vom Mann erzählt, dass er immer solche Phasen hat, wo er sehr schlecht beisammen war, auch zu Hause war, wo er dann ins Spital eingeliefert hat werden müssen. Und das vielleicht Interessante war, dass ein paar Tage später Mann und Frau Blauensteiner munter auf der Straße bei der Apotheke vorbeigegangen sind und hereingewinkt haben, so mit dem, schau, jetzt habe ich ihn wiederum auf Touren gebracht, das ist ja wieder in Ordnung. Und kurze Zeit später hat es geheißen, aber jetzt ist er so schlecht, jetzt wird es bald aus sein mit ihm. Und da haben wir ihm schon fast ein bisschen Wetten abgeschlossen, wie viele Tage wird es dauern, bis der Herr Blauensteiner wieder mit der Zigarette auf der Gasse vor der Apotheke steht. Aber das hat sich dann einige Male abgespielt und einmal war es dann halt wirklich so, dass er dann in Schwarz gekommen ist und gesagt hat, jetzt ist er tatsächlich verstorben.
Wissen Sie, wie traurig es ist, allein zu sein? Da muss man eben jemand haben und wenn ich ihn pflegen kann, dann kann ich von innen heraus etwas geben und das ist wieder meine Natur zu Gott.
Was sagt Ihnen Frau Kröberl?
Frau Kröberl? Die war die ärmste Frau unter den Armen. Die habe ich gefüttert. Die hat sich jahrelang nicht mehr so stark gefühlt, als wie sie bei mir war. Ich habe sie 6 Jahre, die Frau Kröberl verpflegt.
Warum pflegen
Sie hat schon zu viel.
Warum pflegen Sie so gerne?
Was soll ich? Soll ich mal einen Mann wie Sie ins Bett nehmen? Dann nehme ich mir lieber einen alten und pflege ihn. Da habe ich was davon. Lassen Sie sich einmal 11 Tage von der Kripo einvernehmen. 17 Stunden, 12 Stunden. Und dann sagen Sie alles, was die Herren hören wollen. Ich habe Ihnen damit der Freude bereitet und ich war erlöst. Jedoch gibt es noch eine gerichtliche Gerechtigkeit.